So there are 4 beginnings to this particular lecture presentation. This is the first beginning. The first beginning is from our Ecumene book, our pamphlet, and this is on page 34, and it's the first sentence, the topic sentence of the last paragraph of a page or two on thoughts on history. And it reads in this way: only in history is a person free to act. On the mythic horizon, only roles are possible. According to the mythic self-imaged, feeling-toned complex, you can act out a role on the mythic level, but you have to stay in character. There is no real freedom on the mythic level. Real freedom, as we will see today, is a function of the person in their universal movement. And that kind of freedom must be safeguarded. But the ways in which it has been safeguarded for the last 200 years are very perilous. The largest peril is that the finest formulation, philosophically, of that personal freedom in Hegel had a confusion available to it which confused the individual with the state. And that somehow the individual can stand for the state and the state can stand for the individual. And one of the great tragic concluding philosophical statements in the whole history of this planet is from Hegel's philosophy of world history, as he revised it in 1830 at the age of 60 in Berlin. And he died before he was able to revise it a little bit further and guard against misuse. And that same statement reappears 100 years later in the National Socialist Party of Germany. The concluding statement, let's read it direct from the translation. From this examination of the second essential moment in the realization of historical ends, it is evident, if we stop for a moment to consider the political implications, it is evident that a state will be well constituted and internally powerful if the private interest of its citizens coincides with the general end of the state, so that the one can be satisfied and realized through the other. This is very precarious. This is like taking 2 live wires and you want to cross them. If you don't do it in the right way, you become electrocuted. Whereas if you do it in the right way, you extend energy to complete circuit. The wisest human being in these terms was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, in writing to James Madison on this very issue, individual and state power, he used an old legal term which translates, and his phrase was, "The earth belongs to the living." Usufraction was the legal term. The earth belongs to the living. That for those men and women who are alive now, their decisions take precedent over any past people's, no matter how fine or powerful their decisions were. The earth belongs to the living. That in whatever tussle there is to try to determine the best ways to do anything, including living, the decisions of the living must take legal precedent over the decisions of the dead. No matter how wise they were, no matter how right they were, the living have an inalienable right to change those conditions. They have even the right to be wrong. It's difficult, and we live in a time where largely the living who are making decisions are making bad decisions based on incompletenesses that even stagger ignorance. But the truth of the matter is they have a right to do that. They have a right to be wrong, and one must defend the living's right to even be wrong over the truths of the dead. Now, this is very, very difficult to take, especially in a time, an end of the millennia as we live in, where the wisdom of those who came before us is so much more refined and better than what passes as street smarts. There's just no contest whatsoever. And so it takes a great deal of radical conviction. The radicalness is that even though they're doing it terribly bad, they have a right to do it terribly bad. They are the living. Because the alternative to this is super-duper fascism. Okay, that's one beginning. History, only in history is the person free to act. On the mythic horizon, only roles are possible. Now there's a humorous little aside to this. One of the great poems that the Russian Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote, Monologue of a Broadway Actress, where she proclaims what a shoddy thing theater has become, that there are bit parts available everywhere, but not one real role. Well, in Yevtushenko's monologue of a Broadway actress, a real role is for the actor, the actress, for the person. So don't confuse the fact that roles are subservient to some kind of super individuality. This is one of the aspects that Hegel missed. He didn't understand the necessity for play, for theater, for drama, even though for temporary purposes or even for a long time, it's inferior, clearly inferior, to much better thought out plans. The better thought out plans always have to take a back seat to the living. The parent understands that the children have a right to their lives, and they have a right to their mistakes. There's no other way to live. Okay, the second beginning is from one of the books that we're taking as a year-long continuity. We're taking either Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, or Virgil's Aeneid. Just as in the first year we took either the Odyssey of Homer or Moby Dick by Melville. These are year-long works. They're reading journeys meant to help us. They're like a handrail to help us on this very steep path. The path of integration is a path of descent, and towards the end the path of descent becomes precipitous. But the path of differentiation is ascent, and towards the end the path of ascent also becomes precipitous, so that it's not possible to climb. One must learn to fly. And so the classic phrase in Plotinus is that at a threshold where the individual is ready for the cosmos, the alone flies to the real. You have to learn to fly in differentiation. Whereas in integration, you have to learn to free fall. The last stage of integration is an acceptance, a surrender that the slope is too steep. There's no way to climb down any further. One has to let go. And of course, that's the way to enlightenment, to freedom. Unfortunately, very rarely, but there occur times when integration has to be taught, and teachers themselves cannot let go, because if they did, they wouldn't teach anymore. So they get into a ridiculous position of hanging over abyss and saying, "It's all right," while cringing. From the Aeneid, then, our reading for this week, every week we have just a small section. The reading just before this week's section, which is the beginning of Book 11 of the Aeneid, is the end of Book 10, where Aeneas, who is the founder of Rome, the mythic founder of the Roman Empire, the occult magical key by which the whole knot of power in Augustus Caesar's time was tied tight, and that knot has never been cut. It's still there. This is a vignette at the end of Book 10 of the way in which Roman power, in the person of Aeneas, continues to roll over all opposition, regardless of what the opposition is. In this case, the opposition is great warrior, and Aeneas is presented with, again, the option of sparing, but does not. The Etruscans are wavering before the Trojan onslaught. The Etruscans, the original Italians in that area where Rome was founded, and the Trojans, the invading conquerors. Meanwhile, Mezentius, by a wave of the river, propped his slumped frame against a tree trunk, staunching the wound with water. The bronze helmet hung, inverted from the bow. The heavy arms lay quiet on the meadow. Chosen men were standing by. Sick, with labored breath, he let his chin fall forward, rubbed his neck, while over his chest the flowing beard was streaming. Over and over again he asks and sends for Lausus. "Bring him back," he tells the men. Those are the orders from his unhappy father. But they were bringing him back, a big man slain by a big wound. Mezentius knew the sound of sorrow from afar before he heard it, fouled his gray hair with dust, flung up his arms, clung to the body. Oh, my son, was I so fond of living that I sent you to the sword for me? Saved by your wounds, alive when you're dead? The wound indeed is driven deep, the bitterness of death comes home. I was the one, my son, who stained your name with crime, with hatred, driven from throne and scepter. I have owed too long the debt of punishment. And here I am, living and never leaving men and light, but I shall leave. He heaved his sickened weight, pulling himself together, groin and all. Slowly, the wound was deep, but he could stand. He ordered them to bring his horse, that solace, that pride of his, on which he used to ride, victorious out of all the wars. He spoke, and the beast sorrowed with his master's sorrow. Rebus, if anything is ever long for mortal beings, you and I have lived for a long time. Today you carry back these bloody spoils. Aeneas's arms avenging the pangs of Lausus with me, or we both. If no force clears the way, we go down together. O bravest heart, too noble to endure the stranger's order or the Trojan rider. He swung astride, shifted his weight a little, the way he always did, held in both hands a load of darts. The helmet glittered bronze, the horsehair plume was bristling as he rode, madness and grief and shame, all urging on that singleness of purpose. He came on fast, shouting, Aeneas, Aeneas, over and over and over. And his voice was loud and firm. Aeneas heard, rejoiced and recognized, and made his prayer. Let this be true, O Father of the gods, O high Apollo. Then to his foe, come on, and move to meet him with the deadly spear. Mezentius answered, do you frighten me with all that fierceness, now that my son is taken? How meaningless! That was the only way you could destroy me. Now I fear no death. I spare no God. Be quiet, for I come to die. And so you can see the enormous energy of the founding of the Roman Empire, coming to appreciate this relentless death quality, where all values have been lost, all meaning has slipped through the holding fingers of human form, and all that is left is blood vengeance. This becomes the bottom line of the Roman power. The bottom line of Roman power was blood vengeance. Not an eye for an eye, but everything that you are for the eye. The blood vengeance is the obliteration. And of course, the classic Roman example that was held up in Roman education for at least 500 years was the example of Carthage. Rome and Carthage fought several wars, almost like the First and Second World War, these Punic Wars, they're called in history. And Rome, terrorized by the great Carthaginian general Hannibal, who for 17 years terrorized the Roman peninsula with his troops and his elephants. And at last, when a Roman general of genius arose, Scipio Africanus, who was able to out-general Hannibal and defeat Carthage, the decision of the Roman Senate, and this was 260 years before the founding of the Roman Empire already. The decision of the Roman Senate was that the Carthaginians should be punished permanently, absolutely. And the decision was to erase Carthage from the face of the earth forever. So not only were all the men, women, and children killed, all of the buildings were torn down, all of the foundations were pried up, and the earth itself was salted so that nothing else would ever grow there. And today in Tunisia, one can find a salt marsh where the great city of Carthage once stood. It was left by the blood vengeance of the Roman mind as a warning, as a poison sign to all who would cross them. This becomes the mythic blood flow of the state as a universal form. So that after the Roman Empire, all great states have subconsciously in their caw this blood vengeance ethic, if one can call it an ethic. It's a secret ledger kept that those who have crossed us will pay. And of course, we have seen in our own time the tremendous bill collection agency in form of Soviet Union, of Nazi Germany, and of many, many other examples. Some of the worst, hopefully, not to come, to be stopped before they even occur. We're going to come back to Hegel. We're going to come back to this political problem, the political problem of once individuals become powerful enough to become independent in the universe, and they know it, how does one mitigate against independent powers in the universe from simply carving out an empire extension of their own independence, their own power? The third beginning, setting aside the ecumenic quote, setting aside the Aeneid, the third quote, the third beginning, comes from the title Hermes the Thief, this little book by Norman O. Brown, The Evolution of a Myth. Hermes the Thief. It appeared right after the Second World War and made Norman O. Brown very famous. Brown became one of the great philosophers of the 1960s revolutions with a book called Life Against Death. And Life Against Death by Norman O. Brown was, along with Tolkien's War of the Rings and Robert Graves' The White Goddess, mandatory reading in the 60s. Fundamental insights into what was going on, what had been going on, and what are they trying to keep us from having go on. That kind of thing. Hermes the Thief is taken from the Homeric hymn to Hermes. When Homer was beginning his art, before he did the Iliad and the Odyssey, he did portraits of the major gods and wrote these hymns to the major gods. Apollo has a hymn, Hermes has a hymn, and the Homeric hymns are very famous in ancient antiquity. For Hermes, we're used to associating Hermes with wisdom, and indeed he is. Hermes is the psychopomp. He is the guide of the soul into the netherworld and back out of the netherworld into life again. Hermes is the guide. His caduceus, which has the double helix of life energy with the winged sun at the top. This is his staff by which he leads us, is able to guide us through all of the vicissitudes on the descent and all of the mysteries on the ascent. And so Hermes is this great guide of wisdom, Hermes Trismegistus. But in Homeric times, 3,000 years ago, Hermes was essentially, in myth, at his origins, a thief. Hermes the thief. What did Hermes steal? He stole cattle. I know it sounds peculiar. It's sort of like a surreal Zangray to say that Hermes was a cattle rustler. Hermes Trismegistus began his career as a cattle rustler. I mean, it's almost absurd, right? But it's true, and it's so profound, but the profundity is lost in the mists of time, so that very few people understand anymore why it's true. Homer, though he lived 3,000 years ago, did not understand why it was true. And it's one thing that Norman O'Brien points out, one of the greatnesses of his book, is that even as early as Homer, already the understanding of what is going on here was lost. One has to go back, in fact, to Rig Veda, India, which is about 500 to 700 years before Homer, to begin to get any idea at all of what cattle rustling was all about. And one has to remember here that Hermes did not rob, he thieved. He took by stealth. Robbery is when you point the gun and you say, "You've got my wallet." Or as the reply is, remember in Crocodile Dundee, "That's not a knife, this is a knife." You can reply to robbers, but you cannot reply to thieves because you never see thieves. Really good thieves take by stealth, and the best thieves take, and you didn't know that they even took. The most subtle of all thieves are soul stealers. They take your soul before you even know you have one. I mean, it's the famous Irish toast is, "May you be in heaven an hour before the devil knows you're dead." Why? Because he's after your soul. In Christopher Marlowe's, Dr. Faustus Marlowe was a red-bearded, hard-fisted, fighting university radical of his time, killed in a bar fight. He has Dr. Faustus ask Mephistopheles, he says, "Just why does he want our souls anyway?" And Mephistopheles, with this kind of Noel Coward, excellent diction, says the Latin phrase that translates "misery loves company." You see, the deepest motives are very common. The most profoundest things are just very, very apparent. Why would cattle thieving, why is cattle rustling so profound? Because the cattle belong to Helios, the sun god. They belong to Apollo, Apollo's cattle. But even older than Apollo is Helios, the sun god. Helios goes back to the times of ancient Re, 5,000 years ago. And that's just a recent mythic rendition. The actual sun god that those cattle belong to goes back who knows how many tens of thousands of years. When animals were first domesticated. Those animals were domesticated before plants were domesticated, and plants were domesticated first about 10,000 BC, about 12,000 years ago. Animals were first domesticated maybe 20,000 years ago. One of the first animals to be domesticated was the cow. So that cattle are an indication of the primordial quality of men and women, of human beings, coming to understand that they can transform nature. They don't have to just hunt wild animals and nomadically follow them, so that men and women have to fit into the life stories of the animals in order to survive. But that you can turn the tables. You can fit the animals into whatever life cycle you want to have by domesticating those animals. They now have to live according to our cycle, not us according to their cycle. So the old hunter societies were always trapped in the mythic horizon. They could never get out. There were individuals who did get out, but they couldn't stay out, and men and women en large could not leave because life depended on staying with the animals. The first difference, like an anchor point, that once it was founded, like the discovery of fire, it never would be the same again. The domestication of the first animal showed that man en masse could leave the mythic cycle and go to higher level. The simple truth, we don't have to live according to animal cycles anymore. We can live according to what cycles we find are appropriate for us, and the animals will have to fit in with us. Human beings became the authors of their own ritual year cycle for first time. This is extremely powerful. Hermes, as a youngster, his initial career is to steal the cattle of the sun, to steal the very foundations of civilization, to steal the basis upon which man has control over what cycle he will live by. Because if he doesn't have his cattle, then he's regressed back, he has to follow the game. So Hermes steals the basis of civilization. Is extremely powerful. Now there are many parallels to this. The domestication of horses, for instance, is extremely interesting also. And there are later versions of this Hermes the thief in other cultures of stealing horses. We have available to us in the United States most interesting testimony, because it happened within historical times and well documented and understood. The original Plains Indians of the United States lived for 20,000, 25,000 years without horses. And the horses were introduced by the conquistadores. And eventually, the horse was integrated into American Plains Indian culture and produced a catastrophic revolution, just as it had some 15,000 years before in Central Asia, where horses were first domesticated. Horses were first domesticated on the great plains of Central Asia. Even before places like Samarkand were founded, and they go back 7,000, 8,000 years. The tribes of the American Plains Indians who worked the horse into their culture, mastered the horse as an animal that became a tool for their cultural transformations. Those Indian cultures quickly, within several generations, 2 or 3 generations, rose out of Paleolithic level onto threshold of real great civilization. Neolithic stone hunters, in about 3 generations, less than 90 years, became fantastic individual orators, speaking on level to stand with European potentiates. Because the change comes enormously and very fast. Once one changes the dimensions of human reality, by adding a new dimension to human reality, it's like one goes from a 2-dimensional universe where everything is only on the page, only on the surface. By adding just one more dimension, a 3rd dimension, you can lift something off the page into spherical reality. And by adding just one more dimension, time, when you add time to space, instead of having a static, fossilized cubic volume, one has flow and all of its phases. By adding another dimension, consciousness, one changes time-space irrevocably. And there are many dimensions that can be added. What we're looking at here is history in our education, and how history adds a new dimension. It adds a dimension that was not there before in the universe. And by the addition of the dimension of history, one comes to the threshold of being able to realize the cosmos. And the cosmos is radically different from the universe. The universe is always natural. Always natural. Which means to say that it never is. It's always happening, but it never is. Its isness, its existentiality is always selective, and that selection based upon the actions of existence. Whatever really is done, that's the matrix out of which existence happens. And existence has an isness, but nature does not. But the cosmos is radically different from the universe because the cosmos is objective. A cosmos really is. And like any level of isness, like existence, the cosmos is eternal. Once it occurs, there's no way it can ever not occur. It's like existence. Once existence occurs, individual things can come in and out of existence, but existence itself is eternal. There's no way to undo the fact of existence, because there is no power, there's no protagonist in nature that would undo it, because there's nothing there except ongoingness. So too, one of the greatest mysteries of civilization is that when men and women, in their personal individualities, are able to make forms that carry them over the ocean of history, as the Buddha used to say, to the other shore. The other shore is the establishment through conscious recognition that one has a cosmos now, eternally real, within which to live. That one has been saved in the sense that one has come home, and that whatever life one would wish to make, it can be manifested. Whatever can be imagined can be made. The potentials and the possibilities of actuality always outstrip imagination. So one is not limited by imagination at all. Imagination is just school sketchbook. And the actuality and eternal cosmos is infinitely greater. Anything can be manifested then. This is ultimate freedom. In Hegel, he calls that absolute. So let's come to the fourth beginning of the lecture. We have 5 minutes to go before the break. Let's come to the fourth beginning. In his Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, Hegel talks on page 72 about passion. Passion. He says passion is indispensable. He had a habit of using ordinary, everyday terms, and then the more he used them, his great intellect made it more and more like philosophically technical. So one of the great difficulties of translating Hegel's German is that he takes everyday middle-class language and uses it like an elegant, noble swordsman. So that one is constantly astonished that the ordinary meaning takes these sudden plunges and sudden rises and means something extremely profound, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is. Hegel says that passion denotes any human activity which is governed by particular interests, special aims, or, if you will, selfish intentions. Men dedicate the entire energy of their will and character to attaining such ends, and will sacrifice other possible ends, and indeed all other things, to this object. The particular content of such personal ends is so much a part of the individual's will. And to put that phrase together, individual's will, that it determines it completely and is inseparable from it. And it is this that makes the individual what he is. Now, about the same time that Hegel is writing this revision in 1830, another very powerful German thinker who had no university position, in fact was a pessimistic curmudgeon named Schopenhauer. I mean, he would hum to himself, "Kick the old lady down the stairs," just to pass the afternoon. He came up with an enormous philosophical epic that the world was made up of two aspects, will and representation. And that will, when it's strong enough and can control the representations, the world will become what you want to make of it. Do you remember in Silverado where the bar is there and the Midnight Star and Linda Hunt, who's this short little actress, is standing behind the bar, and Kevin Kline is talking with her, and he notices that this little short woman is suddenly on his height, and he looks over the bar, and she's standing on top of a wooden platform, and she smiles at him. She says, "The world is what you make of it." And he toasts her. Of course it is. Will and representation. Hegel says here that will and character Men dedicate the entire energy of their will and character to attaining such ends. So that this entire issue of will and representation, of character and ends, becomes a complication which with the slightest tug becomes a knot that cannot be untied. It was such a subtle, dangerous, precarious situation that in the 1960s, the book that was constantly read alongside of Tolkien and Norman O. Brown and Robert Graves, the book that was constantly read to try and mitigate this and pay attention to this because it was a very serious problem then. It's much more serious now, but it isn't looked at, was a book by Aldous Huxley called Ends and Means. That men and women would do well to be very wide-eyed about ends and means and not get the horse before the cart. That there's something really stupid about getting the horse before the cart. For one thing, you don't get anywhere. And for another thing, because you don't get anywhere and you keep expecting to get somewhere, frustration builds. And in the state that gets nowhere and expects to get somewhere, it looks around for someone to blame. Why are we not getting there? And the level of bloodlust vengeance slowly accumulates like an explosive methane in all the dark corners of the mind. Better not light a match. Which means you have to live in the dark constantly. It's very precarious. Let's take a break. In our education, we've been careful to pay attention to what has been called paredness. And one reason for paredness is focus. Now the yogi doesn't use paredness for focus. The yogi uses ekagrata, uses singularity. But in this world, on this level, when you're dealing with just 4 or 5 dimensions, paredness is enough. You don't have to go high-tech. In fact, if you use the high dharma in this world, you always punch through, you penetrate through. And none of the provisional forms that are necessary to work with existence are able to be handled. You just reach through them. They become phantasmal. So you have to step back and gear down a little bit and use paredness and focus. We saw that the first year of our course is a year of integration, and the second year is a year of differentiation. And they move in opposite directions. Integration always has a kind of a clockwise fashion. It seems to follow the sun, so that integration is kind of like a photosynthesis. It relates to light in its movement, whereas differentiation is a counter movement. It's different. It works in a different way. So this is a pair. Things that come together are paired with things that go apart. The going apart is not a falling apart or a breaking apart, but it's a differentiation. And the processes of differentiation are markedly different from the processes of integration, though the two processes are able to be comprehended together at the same time with a comprehensive, what we would call reality. And there is a language that one can use to speak about integration and differentiation in the same breath, and that language is called mathematics. And one can learn to speak that language in a very refined way. By close of 20th century, by the close of the 20th century, the possibilities are now understood to be infinite. It's on the same level of musical scales. Most music has been written in just a handful of musical scales. The Chinese pentatonic, the Lydian, Mixolydian, a few scales. We know now from electronic music investigations that there are an infinite number of musical scales. There are so many musical forms yet to be even discovered that it dwarfs all the music that has been done. There just simply is no contest. What has been done is infinitesimally small compared to what man can do if he just wakes up. Now this is true on political level. The political forms that have been used so far by our species are infinitesimally paltry compared to the gorgeous possibility, the array of political forms that are possible, not only theoretically, but also in a practical sense. Jefferson's conviction was that there have been free men, and some women, in history, but no one has seen what would happen if you freed several million people at the same time. What would they do? And so the whole founding of the United States in 1800, the United States was not founded in 1788 or in 1776 or any other period, 1800, with the election of Thomas Jefferson. It's called the Revolution of 1800. And the whole theory and game plan of the state changed. The political party that was there before Jefferson were called Federalists or Whigs because of wigginess. Notice how the language has still kept wigginess in a kind of a metaphor. And so the United States became an experiment, the great experiment. That's what it was called. Let's see what will happen if we turn millions of men and women free, and in order to provide them with a landscape, the Louisiana Purchase simply tripled the size of the United States overnight. Now this quality, this pairedness that leads to a focus, and that focus, once it's brought into play with possibilities of real maturity, lead to infinite freedoms. And that this is true of musical scales and also of political forms, has a kind of imperative for us because we live at a particular time where the actuality, the decision to actually do this, is here before us. It's on the table at the present time. What forbids this from happening, what forbids this from going on, is massive ignorance. Massive being buffaloed by illusion. And when you believe illusions, those beliefs are delusions. And delusion, when it's called samsara, means that it's sediment thousands of years thick. And it's very difficult to muck around because you only stir up the sediment and make the water muddy. And it's very difficult to come out of that. And yet, as the old saying is, the lotus does come out of that. It comes out of the sediment, the mud, the water, into the light. And flowers. And so our species is going to flower too. Going to come out of the mud of this world and flower into a cosmos. Going to really shine. And it's going to be all right. The reason that this can be stated unequivocally is that all of the bones are already made. and they just have to be fleshed out. There just need to be people who live this way, and it will all be there. But the bones have already been done. Now in this pairedness, in this focus, that leads eventually to infinite new political forms, leads to real cosmos. One of the great giant steps on the way, the last great giant leap, is really over history. One has to get through history, not to become post-historical. That's a Vanity Fair delusion, very famous. Not to become non-historical, but to master the processes of history like the processes of myth were mastered long ago. In Hegel, in his realization of the spirit in history, that revision of his lectures on the philosophy of world history, he writes, after the creation of the natural universe, man appears on the scene as the antithesis of nature. He is the being who raises himself up into a second world. The general consciousness of man includes two distinct provinces, that of nature and that of the spirit. Nature and spirit. We might prefer to use the term consciousness, but consciousness does not have the power and standing of spirit. Spirit, as an old alchemical term, refers to the way in which water becomes wine. Spirits. Through fermentation. This quality of transformation, of change, this fermentation of the mind, the fermentation of the mind, yields this consciousness. Sometimes in the old Mahayana, they used to call it perfuming. That when a human being became conscious, that consciousness was like a perfume that pervaded their existence. And a certain gorgeous graciousness began to occur in everything that they did. Movements started to have a certain kind of an elegance to them. Words began to have this quality of ineffable, mysterious character. Thought, instead of being precisely lined like a razor's edge, became exfoliated and shined like the sunlight glinting off the edge of a good argument. Nature and man, that man comes somehow out of nature into spirit, and that this movement, this coming out, this emerging, has something to do with the way in which this particular education works. Later on, Hegel, after several pages, writes a statement like this: the most immediate knowledge spirit can have of itself when it assumes the shape of a human individual is that it is capable of feeling. Feeling is very difficult to talk about feeling with ideational language and not have it sound sophomoric. It's very difficult to talk about the idea of feeling, because the most schmaltzy language is actually the only true language that one can say. It's like when you really fall in love, you're absolutely astounded that the really truthful thing you can say is that I love you. schmaltzy as it is, it happens to be true. And one is stymied by the humility of the profundity that truth brings with it. And you have to give up the cynicism. And so some of the most schmaltzy language that we would be loath to find ourselves saying in public is actually the only true way to speak when one comes to some of these things. And that is that feeling has an intelligence, but its intelligence has nothing to do whatsoever with ideas. The intelligence of feeling has to do with the way in which patterns of experience come together and nurture. Patterns of experience that integrate into nurturing are the nexes around which feeling moves. If there were not these flowers of experience, the winds, the air of experience would not flow and become wind. It's the flowers of experience that encourage the air to have a movement. And so when one has a quality in one's life of a whole field of flowers of experience, one experiences a vast freshness. It's this kind of language, schmaltzy as it is actually true. Is the only way that one can speak. When that wind flowing over the patterns, the flowers of experience, when it blows, because it's in an integral mode, it blows inwards. And one absorbs the freshness as a quality of awareness. The freshness of the flowers of experience become a dimension of alertness and awareness within. Because that's what's going on. What's the reason for this? Because that's what's happening. When pressed for an ultimate phrase that would describe exactly what goes on, the great Roman Empire physicist Lucretius entitled his book about exactly what goes on, The Way Things Are. Why is it that way? Because that's the way things are. De rerum natura. That's how it is. If you want to know, you can trust that that's how it is. What does the old smith tell the young Conan in Conan the Barbarian? He says, you cannot trust many things in the world, and he holds up a sword and he says, this, steel, you can trust. You can trust this because this is how things work, and the more that you trust it, whatever you do based on that will work. It will begin to work. How do bumblebees fly? They simply fly. Whereas the famous computation in the early days of World War II, the engineers were trying to figure out about aircraft, and aeronautical engineers found out that bees cannot fly. Their wings are too small for the weight of their bodies. They cannot fly. They're aerodynamically unsound. They cannot fly. Yet they do fly. And it became kind of like a peculiarity that the American hotshot airplane designers sort of took as a motto, and they ascribed the mechanical difficulties of aircraft not to impossibilities but to gremlins. And if you can get rid of the gremlins, the airplane will work even though it shouldn't. It will, nevertheless, it will work. And out of this came the American phrase, the American industrial phrase, can do. It doesn't matter that it's impossible. If we can work the gremlins out of it, it'll work anyway. And so this kind of Marx Brothers madness took over American industry and just simply outstripped the Third Reich. I mean, in a couple of years, American productivity just went off the graph. I mean, Hitler was getting the lists of how many hundreds of aircraft were being downed, and then he got the lists of how many tens of thousands American industry was turning out. I mean, Los Angeles County was turning out something like 30,000 planes. The most fervid Nazis could not shoot down 30,000 planes a year. And so they lost heart because they realized that these crazy goddamn Americans, they don't know when they're beat, right? They have no respect for the Reich. What was George Patton's famous phrase that Coppola put into that wonderful screenplay and George C. Scott delivered? He said, give me enough gas and I'll go anywhere. I'll take the Third Army with me. This can-do, this interiorization of the freshness of the moving air that constellates around the flowers of experience, this is the way in which language becomes mind. Mind is a vastness. It's the infinite vast dimension of all the possibilities that language is able to engender. So that one of the qualities, one of the classic litmus tests of somebody who can think is, can they speak extemporaneously? Somebody who has mind can speak extemporaneously. No notes. No notes. And the highest artistic sense of the extempore speaker is someone who can compose a poem spontaneously and deliver it and say it. So that in the ancient wisdom traditions, the seal of graduation was, can you deliver your own personal spontaneous hymn to the divine? Can you write that poetic hymn of thanksgiving from your own experience extemporaneously? So that whenever you find in world history on this planet great spiritual personages who have mind, they are all able to write spontaneous poems. St. Francis of Assisi or Milarepa. All of the great geniuses, as we would say, of the clear mind, all have this capacity. They could all do this. The language base upon which such a poem is based, the interior foundation upon which one would build the awareness and the interiorized meaning that would become conscious in this way, is feeling and not ideas. Feeling. So that the most healthful of all of the currents that is available to our species is that health of wholeness of feeling. And the realm of the wholeness of feeling is the realm of myth. The mythic horizon. The river of experience. The flow that can become conscious. And one of the most puzzling and difficult handcuffing of all resistances is that the more that history comes into play, the more it displaces myth. The more that history becomes conscious, the more that myth becomes subconscious, not unconscious, is subconscious. Still there, still needs to be carried over, still needs to be kept track of. Remember the adding up of columns of figures, and you have to carry more numbers than this column can hold over. That realm, the subtext, the supratext, the subconscious, the supraconsciousness, however you want to style it. Just as when vision came into play, nature had to be displaced. And just as when art came into play, ritual had to be displaced. Now, as history comes into play, myth is displaced. Not out of superiority. It has nothing to do with a Reich. All Reichs are irrelevant. You can scrawl that on the walls. I saw it once in Hollywood in a version. It was beautiful. It was scrawled in joyous black against a white wall. It said, "Don't worry, it is 100% out of your hands." All Reichs are irrelevant. But notice that as history, as a conscious differential process, is mastered, myth and all of experience and all of feeling, the interiorization qualities of language tend to become subconscious. So the only way to know that you still have them, that they're still there, that they still work, is to just do it and count that spontaneously they're there and they'll work. So that one of the deadliest perils there is in historical consciousness is to start to second guess yourself by plans within plans. When you start to plan of how to plan, it's a sure sign that you have devolved and you're on devolution. And the greatest example of spinning your wheels about planning how to make plans to plan is the United States Congress. You can plan of how to make plans that will plan to make plans that will plan right forever. There is no way in heaven or hell that anything can be done that way. That doesn't do anything. Is it the cart before the horse? Yeah. One has to trust that feeling is still there. Feeling is still intelligent, even though in consciousness, what now displaces feeling as an operative process is historical differentiation. And it's the most difficult transition of all. Because tied up on the mythic level, tied up with myth is language, tied up with myth is experience, tied up with myth is culture, and tied with culture are all the tribal forms, and all of those have to subside together, and they don't want to. All of those fight against going under, as if it were some kind of a death. And so the development of historical consciousness is genuine apocalyptic crisis for everything on mythic level, the whole mythic horizon. So that there are whole rituals that have been developed to help us celebrate the going underground of feeling, the going underground of experience, the going underground of all tribal forms, of all interiorization, integral tendencies, to celebrate them. And the best way to distractedly help us celebrate is to focus the celebration upon children. And the great holiday that has come out about this is Halloween. and that every Halloween is paired with next Easter. What's going to go underneath is going to get to come out again. That it's not dying, but that it's going into a transformational mode. And that transformation needs to be done secretly, quietly, within. It's very, very difficult without this kind of convincing of ourselves by the use of the most definite promise of the future, children, to help us to ceremonially celebrate that it's all right to do this. It is all right because one of the most profound, original, civilizing, transformational symbols was that the tomb is also a womb. That you not go into that cave to be buried forever, but you go into that cave to transform so that you can come out again renewed. That the seed and spark of life goes into the womb, not to be buried, but to be reborn. It's absolutely essential that the cycle be there, and that the rebirth cycle not be a circle. Remember how we talked about this? That if it's circular, it short circuits. If it's circular, it short circuits and you get a Roman Empire or a Third Reich or a Soviet Union. Sure as hell. It may take a while, but that's what you get. If you put those ingredients into the oven, that's what you're going to get. So the wise thing is, don't start stocking up nuclear weapons to fight the Fourth Reich. You can't stock enough nuclear weapons for those guys. The way to fight them is to live in such a way that that possibility never occurs. You steal the thunder of the Fourth Reich now before those guys are even born. Because as long as the cycle is a spiral, that can't happen. And the difference between a circle and a spiral is that the return is separated from the original by at least the space of one person. Even if the space is only one person wide in the whole cosmos, it still is not a circle. Small as it is, it's a spiral. And that Fourth Reich will never happen. And as long as there is always someone, even just one, to be there, to really be there, those guys are not going to be born. Yes, that possibility is there mathematically. Hey, it's inevitable on the page. But it's not going to happen. Bees are going to continue to fly because there's always some trickster in the works who doesn't believe that it's inevitable. Who says, well, for me it's not inevitable. And that's how you win a pennant. Because you just refuse to make an out. And so you're always at bat. And the Fourth Reich guys are impatient. You thought the Third Reich guys were bad. These guys are terribly... They're going to go to some other universe. It's always at bat. We never get up. So it's that kind of equality where freedom and the individual are paired eternally, indissolubly. They're always there. Hegel, in some of his better language, writes it this way. On the one hand, the spirit of the nation is in essence particular, yet on the other, it is identical with the absolute universal spirit, for the latter is one. The absolute universal spirit, one with a capital Oh, Hegel gets this from Plotinus. And Plotinus gets it from the Hermetic tradition, and that comes from ancient wisdom. On the one hand, the spirit of the nation is in essence particular, yet on the other it is identical with the absolute universal spirit, for the latter is one. The world spirit, this is in bold letters, the world spirit is the spirit of the world as it reveals itself through the human consciousness. Now this also goes back to Plotinus, and one needs to understand here that there was a great vision. Plotinus taking the battle right to the center of the bull's mouth, took his teaching from Alexandria right into Rome, right into the base of all the power there was in the world, at the base of the Capitoline Hill. He taught in his own home, right there within sight of the Caesar's palace and the Roman Forum and the whole thing. He had as his students the Emperor Aurelian and his wife and most of the powerful Roman senators, and just was on the verge of really making a difference when he died of a diphtheria epidemic. And the whole thing just unraveled. He had imperial permission to build an experimental city on the coast of Campania, south of Rome, to show what a philosopher's kingdom would be if it actually were set up and worked. And he was very capable. He could have done it. He died in 269 AD, and by 271 AD, the whole thing was gone. It's unraveled. Plotinus, in his great vision, said, one spirit has never been seen, that individual spirits have been seen, that every conscious being has above them a guardian spirit. And the guardian spirit is always one level higher than the highest level of your consciousness. So that sometimes a guardian spirit is also called a tutorial spirit. Your inner teacher, your higher self. All these words come from Plotinus' great vision. It's in the Aeneads, it's under the section Guardian Spirit. The guardian spirit rises every time your level of consciousness rises. And these are not infinite levels, but there are 7 levels. In time-space, in this universe, there are only 7 levels. And when your consciousness rises to the 7th level, your guardian spirit is on the 8th level. And on the 8th level is a vast open silence, because it's not co-opted into the manipulative system of the 7. All that's there on the 8th level is a vast open silence, so that your guardian spirit, your tutorial spirit, becomes that vast open silence. And when you raise your consciousness, one last step, that 8th step, you enter into that vast open silence, but because you enter into it as a person, you bring with you all of your personal capacities. And Plotinus says, in the open, vast silence of the 8th, one hears God singing on the 9th. He says, in a great vision, still operative here in Hegel, the whole essence of Hegel is Plotinus, that one spirit that has never been seen is the spirit of a unified mankind, that individual spirits of individuals have from time to time been seen. And we know that there are communities of men and women who come together and have a communal spirit, and those have been seen. But no one has ever seen the mysterious, sacred, guardian spirit of mankind as a whole. And that before this cosmos is really finished, that spirit has to be seen, has to be let free. And the whole imperative of having a single mankind, an ecumene, is that they can together as a whole rise to that 8th level and let that spirit of mankind as a whole hear God singing. This is a inversion of the old Hemingway thing, never ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Always ask for whom God sings. God sings for thee. But God's song has never been heard by the spirit of mankind as a whole, because we haven't manifested that yet. That's what's going on here in Hegel, is this tremendous dedication by somebody who has a 200 IQ, 200 years ago, trying to find some way to say, how can we do this? And in saying it, trying to be so exact, so specific, but using everyday language so frequently in odd ways that the language became almost impossibly convoluted, like that, so that people have been trying to read it like this, and you cannot read like that. There's no way. Out of Hegel comes a whole century of historical perspectives, mostly pro or con him, for or against. The subtlest of all of the developments was Jacob Burckhardt. Burckhardt is in many ways the greatest of all the Hegelians, and yet he's the greatest of all because he consciously pits himself against this, against systematizing, and yet keeps in mind this fantastic realization that Hegel had about the state, that somehow the individual and the state are a pair. There's something about the individual and the state. They have a similar genesis, a similar way of coming about. And Hegel says they're exchangeable. And what Burckhardt wants to know, what he investigates here, was there ever a time when an individual was powerful enough to be interchangeable with the greatest idea of the state? Yes, the whole formulation of the Roman Empire was on the basis that Augustus Caesar as an individual was equal to the entire Roman Empire. The whole basis of modern states are recreations of this very, how can we say this? This identity, this equation, this A equals A. The whole notion somehow that slips into subconsciousness with a blood vengeance tone to it is that the state somehow is a super individual, a superman. The mistaking of the world spirit of a single mankind for the world spirit of the universal state. And that mistake leads to Der Führer in straight line, no digressions, lined with jackboots all the way through the stadium. When Ms. Riefenstahl did her film Triumph of the Will, at the very crux of the ceremony, all the troops are in reverent, sacred, silent attention, like a vast silent space, and the only movement is Der Führer and his two sidekicks walking down the long aisle to the great podium, behind which is the swastikas on football-size banners. His Uncle Carl Jung used to say, we don't have archetypes, they have us. And they have us until we mature to the point in our individuality, in our persons, where we understand that they must be parts of a ratio of the real and not the whole show. That archetypal energies are able to be dealt with in ratios, but not in wholes. As long as they are cardinal whole numbers, they're cardinal sins waiting to be committed. And subconsciously, with all those cardinalities of archetypal energies, are all the ordinal subconscious spacings to which we are then subjected. You will all line up here, and you will shoot all these people who are lined up there. Why? Because that's the way it must be. Bullshit. As I mentioned to somebody before the lecture began today, when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Juan Ramon Jimenez told the world, he said, if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. Ray Bradbury quoted him in one of his books. It's this quality where the state cannot abide by the existence of a competing individual. Let me say it once more so that you can hear it really sound. The state cannot survive in reality as long as there is one real individual pitted against it. Will Durant took as the title for his book of that whole epic, Caesar and Christ. There's no way that Caesar energy doesn't leak unless they can get rid of the last individual. That's why those guys with black helmets and machine guns are those white guys with Darth Vader. That's why, no matter what color they're dressed in, their uniforms, they have to get rid of every individual. And that's the only way that the delusion of the state can maintain itself. A single exception is an energy leak. The balloon has got a hole in it. That's why it goes to infinite expense and trouble to get rid of a single trouble causer. What was the scene in Casablanca where he goes up and he tells the orchestra to play La Marseillaise and he sings, and the Nazi guy says, "You see, we can't get rid of him, and we can't allow him to live either. One guy like that. Where's it going to stop?" Well, it's not going to stop. Why? Because the state and the individual have equal weight in reality. Is the whole basis of Gandhian satyagraha. In 1932, when Gandhi went to England to the Round Table Conference, the British Empire was arrayed around this huge table in front of the huge mirrors, over the huge fireplaces with all the huge antiques, and representing India was Gandhi, one little brown man. And he won. Because he didn't flinch. Because the single spiritual personality is equal to the entire empire in reality. And when you know that that teeter-totter can be maintained indefinitely, all you need to do is make sure that you train somebody to come and stand in your place. All you need is one. And as long as somebody is there, it's never going to happen. It looks like they can't possibly be defeated, but subconsciously they know they can't possibly win. That's the nature of good and evil. One match in a dark universe would create a blinding light. Have you ever been in a cave where there's no natural light? And you light one match? It's blinding. You can barely stand it. Next week we're going to take an interval. We're going to let history go. We've explored it enough that you have a taste for it. You can go back like all these other sections. But now we need to move on to science. And science is the exploration of the cosmos, the objective cosmos, which really already exists. But we need an interval in between history and science. Every one of our sections has an interval. And the interval in between history and science that I'm using is the Dhammapada. It's a collection of the sayings of the historical Buddha. And the sayings were kept together in memory. And 100 years on the centenary of the Buddha's, well, they don't call it a death, they call it the parinirvana. After 100 years, the monks all came together again, and they tried to recreate the living presence of the Buddha, and they found that they could do this by juxtaposing various bits of language into a single pattern. And the Dhammapada is the pattern of the great flower of the Buddha's experience, and the symbol of that flower belongs not on a banner, no matter how huge it is. It doesn't belong in an icon, but it belongs on the sole of the feet of those who walk that way of life. Like the old American Indian prayer, may I walk a mile in a man's moccasins before I criticize him. And so when the third great council of the Buddhists was held, after 250 years after the Buddha's death, the Dhammapada was put into symbolic pattern on the soles of a pair of feet. And right on the arch of this pair of feet was a pair of flowers, one for the integral mode, one for the differential mode. And with these feet and these flowers on the arch of your movement, you can walk all the way to enlightenment by yourself. All you need is diligence and just not to give up. And the man who put those flowered feet there in front of the Bodhi tree, his name was Ashoka. And in order to make them really conspicuous, because Ashoka knew all about power, he made them quite big. They're about size 24 feet. And they're carved in stone. And over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia, various pilgrims have taken bits of saffron color and washed those feet, those footprints, and then taken hand-spun cloth called khadi by the Gandhians and placed that over and made an impress of those feet. And over the long millennia, the flowers have rubbed off, and so you have to just know that they're there. And all that's left are the two giant footprints. And I have one of those rubbings from Bodh Gaya, and it covers the computer in the back room. And if you like, you can take a look at it. With the saffron color and the hand-spun khadi, just like ancient times. As long as those feet are what you walk in your life with, there's no way any of those guys from the Fourth Reich will ever be born in this particular universe. They'll have to go someplace else. Next week, the Dhammapada.